The post lamps flickered to life, illuminating the beige Model B that sat idle by the curb. Within, Detective Rick Sawyer brushed the back of his hand across his forehead, pulling away thick beads of sweat. He had spent the last few years riding solo. His last partner, Mitch, had been taken down during a failed robbery attempt, and sharing it with someone else almost felt wrong. He simply had to be more careful. A thin paper roll sat between his lips and smoke billowed occasionally from the driver window. He would finish it off and head off for his rounds. The air was molasses, but Rick could smell the rain coming. It was mid-July in Cincinnati. The heat would almost make the devil cry, and storms were as unpredictable as Jerry Lewis. In an instant, the heavens opened and the police cruiser was bombarded with droplets. He cursed a bit before flicking what remained of his cigarette out into the flood and rolled out the window. His shift was almost over, but he would need to make one more round through the neighborhood before heading home. Might as well get the show over with, he told himself while the engine roared to life. A replay of the Reds game lulled on the radio, the announcer commenting on the talent of a pitcher named Joe Nuxel. Rick shook his head at the thought of a 15-year-old major leaguer. Just as the thought had passed, his eyes caught sight of a man standing under a street lamp about a block down. He leaned against the post despite the rain pelting him. He was a tall, slender man with a light gray business suit clinging to his frame. One could easily tell the weather had destroyed what might have been a clean-cut look. Rick couldn't quite understand why he would just stand there in this downpour, but figured he must be stranded or something. The tires of the coupe diverted to the other side of the road, and the brakes squealed to a stop. As the detective leaned over the passenger side to lower the window, he noticed the man was flipping a coin in one hand. This seemed even odder considering the circumstances. Once the barrier between them dropped, Rick called out in the elements. "You all right, pal?"
"Just waiting on my ride,"
the stranger said, not seeming fazed by the fact that he looked as though he just fell out of the local swimming pool. Rick's brow furrowed, feeling slightly unnerved by how nonchalant this guy seemed to be. After a moment of silence, the detective spoke again. "It's getting pretty rough out here. Is there somewhere I can take you?" The man's hand snapped closed on the coin finally, and the sudden motion made Rick's hand slide to his service pistol by instinct. Rick's eyes trained on the other hand that remained in the guy's pocket during his approach. The hand pulled free of the stranger's slacks and held nothing in it. Rick relaxed and watched as the man leaned down to the window before agreeing. Most people would not have taken the offer so lightly, but this man honestly didn't seem bothered in the slightest by his plight. Something was wrong, Rick could tell, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. And something in his smile and the ease of his words only served to unsettle the detective. And as the passenger door opened, Rick's .38 Special slid from its holster and rested on his lap. Rick knew the weapon would be covered by his coat, and this way it was ready if he needed it. His passenger took a seat and closed the door and gave the detective a smile.
"Thanks."
The man's words came dripping like the rest of them. Rick tried not to think of having to clean the upholstery because he was sure that this was the least of his problems at this particular moment. Rick asked his destination, and when he received his answer, he fought the urge to curse the thought of having to drive across town. The trip would put him an hour late coming home, and he knew his wife wouldn't be too happy. Instead, he simply put the car in gear and made his way out of the neighborhood in silence. The quiet was unnerving, Rick's hand tightening on the steering wheel. His words tried to cut the thickness. "So, what are you doing out in this mess anyway?" The man's head tilted slightly, and his eyes squinted a bit as if he had to think of a good answer. Rick had seen many guilty men look at him this way when they were trying to come up with an alibi, and the whole scene caused his thumb to rest on the hammer of his pistol. The man began turning the coin between his fingers and gave a slight smile before ever responding.
"Just headed down south to visit an old friend of mine. I hear he's a musician now and doing pretty good for himself.
The guy's voice became upbeat. Rick wasn't sure what was more unsettling, the silence or the smile.
Speaking of which,
The stranger paused and pointed to the dash.
you mind if I find us some music?
Rick really wasn't in the mood for music now, but it would be better than listening to his new passenger talk. A nod signaled an agreement, and the man's fingers twisted at the dial. Static and garbled signals went by for a few seconds before the station came in clear. Wailings of a guitar and the slow, somber tones that old colored folks spoke about came blaring through the speakers. Definitely hadn't expected a well-dressed white man to listen to this kind of music, but if it kept him quiet, that was all the better. 20 minutes later, the cruiser came to a stop in front of an apartment building that took up the block. The windows seemed boarded and the whole neighborhood felt more like a grave. It couldn't have been someone's home, and Rick knew this. The concern must have been clearly printed on the detective's forehead, because when the passenger noticed, he laughed slightly. The sound snatched Rick from his thoughts, and a low metallic click could be heard as the pressure of his thumb became more than the hammer spring could hold back anymore. Rick brushed the sticky liquid away that collected under his hairline again, as the man began to point out the window. The detective's eyes followed and came to rest on the flickering light of a phone booth. It sat upon the corner of the intersection approximately 20 feet away. Rick wanted to scream, but bet against it. They had passed at least 3 dozen payphones during this trip. What made this one so special? The detective couldn't take it anymore. "Not trying to be rude, mister, but why did we have to go across town to this payphone?" The man gave that sick, toothy smirk again and slid his hand toward his coat breast pocket. Rick's hand gripped the pistol now and ready to bring it into play. The hand emerged holding a pack of cigarettes that the passenger shook slightly, the smile growing. Rick felt like he was being taunted by this guy, and every second his pistol shook more in his hand. He hadn't had to discharge his firearm since he lost Mitch. The incident still left a mark on his memory, and right now, it made it difficult not to draw on the stranger. The possibilities of what would follow streamed through his head. The man had brought him to a secluded part of the city, and every look and word seemed to mock the detective. Even now, as his passenger pressed a cigarette between his lips and lit the tip, that smile still lingered on the corners of his mouth. The lid to the lighter snapped closed, causing Rick to jolt slightly.
Where I am headed is this way. Thanks for the ride, friend.
The stranger said, as he flipped the coin into the air. It turned a few times before coming to rest on the dashboard. It wobbled along the edge for a moment before stopping flat. Now that it was closer, the detective could see that one side appeared gold and the other silver. A star was etched on the face of it, but not any star Rick had ever seen previously. The marks weren't machine-made, that's for sure. The click of the door opening pulled the detective's eyes back to the passenger. He was already lifting himself back up into the rain with a still-lit cigarette. The drops quickly snuffed out the smoke, and the man awkwardly just held it there at any rate. Then the man leaned back to the window and pointed to the dashboard again.
That's my friend singing now. I think you might like it,
he quipped, before turning to walk toward the phone booth. Rick watched the man for a moment, but the word to the song drew his attention. A young man's voice wailed over sharp guitar riffs. The voice seemed to be asking for help and not receiving any. The next verse began, and the words seemed to echo in Rick's ears. He turned to look up at the man again, now standing in the phone booth.
Yo standing at the crossroad. Tried to flag a ride. Oh, I tried to flag a ride. Didn't nobody seem to know me, babe. Everybody passed me by.
Rick watched intently as the stranger pulled another coin from his pocket. It caught the glow inside the booth, and the detective could tell it was a duplicate of the one that now sat on his dash. Rick took the small sliver of metal in his hand, running his thumb along the etching as the song continued to flow through his cab.
Standing at the crossroad, baby. Rising sun going down. Standing at the crossroad, baby. Rising sun going down. I believe to my soul now. Poor Bob is sinking down.
A chill rose up Rick's back, and he could feel the hair on his neck rise. Rick put the car in drive and eased forward, watching the man lift the receiver. As he passed, the figure waved and gave another smirk before fingering in his desired number. The wailing permeated throughout the cruiser for the next verse.
And I went to the crossroad, Mama. I looked east and west. I went to the crossroads, baby. I looked east and west. Lord, I didn't have no sweet woman, oh well, babe, in my distress.
The song ended while Rick put the car in reverse. He came to a stop once more under the light of the phone booth, and the announcer began clamoring about the previous artist, Robert Johnson. The voice elaborated on his talent but changed to a sorrowful tone when he expressed his condolences to any friends or family that may be listening. Then another song was announced, stating the artist released it the year he died, 1938. Rick had been staring at the booth until those words rang out and was pulled back to the radio. He spoke to himself in the dark. That can't be right. That was 6 years ago. The next song began to play as Rick sat dazed at his experience. He looked down at the coin and turned it in his fingers again to see the opposite side had another crudely drawn star symbol. He had been shaken, and pistol still gripped in his palm. The stranger smiled at Rick again as a detective stepped from the car finally. His gun drew across the top of the car as he yelled out, "Who the hell are you?" The stranger stepped out of the booth still holding the phone.
You can call me Scratch,
he said with a wink.
I've got to be going now, Rick.
You're not going anywhere until I find out what's going on here, the detective yelled out into the night. The Scratch laughed in a sly and amused tone.
I don't think you quite get it, my friend. But when you do, just use that coin I gave you. I will be seeing you around. Maybe you and I can make a deal too.
And with that, he stepped back into the booth and dropped his coin into the slot. Rick barked at the man, "Freeze!" And just as the words rang out, the man faded away, his body dissipating like smoke across the stars. The shock caused the detective to pull the trigger, and the crack of the shot and breaking glass echoed through the street. The receiver shattered still in midair before tumbling to the floor of the booth. Rick's eyes drew open wide and his mouth hung open agape. Slowly, his knees gave out beneath him, and his body sat back to the driver's seat. Then, sliding his hand under his coat, he removed a small chrome tin container. Twisting the cap loose, he turned it up to his lips. He rarely drank, but this moment seemed like the right opportunity for a few sips. He took another drink as he contemplated the previous 45 minutes. The thought came slowly, but like a slap in the face. Who had been in my car? And how the hell did he know my name? A star-spangled blanket draped over the pine box as Brian stood steady. He had to be strong for his mother, who was currently buried against his borrowed black suit, sobbing heavily. He only flinched when the crack of the rifles echoed through the air. Men in uniform, both military and Cincinnati police, gave their respects. Tokens of gratitude coated the coffin, and a neatly folded flag was placed in his mother's hands. She clutched it tightly, as if it were the only thing in the world. Brian rubbed her back and stared down toward a box containing a stranger. He had not had a chance to know his father, despite all he had heard from his mother and his father's friends. Each one had a story about Rick Sawyer, his heroism and bravery, honesty and loyalty. He was the greatest man many of them had ever known. That wasn't the man Brian knew. His father was an empty seat at dinner and a vacant placeholder during school events. Brian's mother always assured him that his father loved him, just hadn't been as affectionate since his time in the war. Brian never knew. Those 3 words had never come, and now they never would. The last thing his father ever told him was that the world was an evil place, and that he should be wary of it. He left that day more confused, lost, and angry than ever. After walking his mother to her car, he found a place on a bench at the edge of the cemetery to think. Reaching up, he brushed at his hair and pushed away his perspiration. The long, draping hair, in style for his age, made it unbearable in the summer months. His mother would always say he looked so much like a younger version of his father. Thinking about that now made tears well up around his green eyes. The crowd slowly left the plot, but one remained, leaning over to place a small gift upon the headstone. Brian couldn't place him as one of his father's fellow soldiers, officers, or friends, at least not the ones he had ever met. He was tall and thin, dressed fairly well even if slightly out of date. His hair was dark and slicked back, and made him look professional even in this dreary place. He was curious to see the gift that had been left there and quickly rose from the bench to investigate. Clouds closed over the sun as Brian approached the man and droplets began to tap at his shoulders. The figure turned away slightly toward Brian, and in turn, Brian tossed up a few fingers. He cursed to himself as the drops came quicker, his hair becoming matted to his face. He quickly pulled his jacket up over his head for shelter, but when his eyes returned to the gravesite, the man was gone. When his feet came to rest over his father's resting place, he turned in each direction in search of the final visitor. The man had disappeared, but his gift remained. Lifting what appeared to be a coin with an etching of what appeared to be a star, Brian examined each side. It was rough to the touch, jagged at the corners, and obvious to Brian that it had been done with a rough instrument. He shoved the trinket down into his pocket and sprinted toward his car for shelter. He looked for any sign of the man as he exited, but there was none. The next few months had been spent preparing for the sale of the family home. Brian's mother claimed she didn't think she could live in a home that constantly reminded her of Rick. Eventually, a potential buyer expressed interest, and any items that remained would need to be cleared out. The two of them had already found a smaller apartment that would suit their needs, and his mother didn't wish to return to the old home. Brian would be off to college soon, but he wanted to make sure he had everything taken care of beforehand. His mother still wasn't quite ready for him to go, and Brian knew this. But he also had a life that had been put on pause ever since his father's death. Brian offered to clean out the old house. He selfishly had his own reasons for wanting to go, though. He had always wanted to see what hid behind the door of his father's study. It had been a place he had so often been warned of, and this was his opportunity to learn a little bit about the man he seldom ever saw. It took a week to get the majority of the house packed away in boxes. Most wouldn't be making the move to the apartment. What they needed would come with Brian. The rest would be sold or donated. Brian saved one room for last intentionally, granting himself time to investigate. His hand shook slightly as he reached for the shiny bronze knob, remnants of days when the effort could lead to an argument. He honestly had no idea what he would find. Then, steeling his nerves, the knob turned and the door gave way. It was underwhelming at best. A small wooden desk with a lamp, a leather armchair tucked in the corner, a large bookshelf upon one wall, and file cabinets on the other. A window behind the desk illuminated the only mystery of the room, his father's work. Brian's hands feathered at the papers, mostly news articles and files that hadn't been returned to their place. Everything had already been coated in a very thin layer of dust. He picked them up one at a time and shuffled through them and sorted each in its specific boxes. After clearing out the file cabinets and removing the books from all the shelves, Brian took to the desk. Each drawer filled their own box, and he neatly printed Dad's study on each one. Bending down, he reached for the last drawer at the bottom. The drawer fought back, and an audible clink was heard. "Damn, locked," Brian huffed. He dug through his pockets for the set of keys his mother had given him. It took a few minutes, shuffling through 24 keys before finding one that would fit. Brian paused for a moment before opening it. Standing there in a once forbidden room, opening the only thing that was locked was almost adventurous. He could feel a smile play on his lips, like a pirate opening a chest, surely full of treasure. As the drawer opened, Brian's eyes fell on something less than astonishing. The most notable item, at first glance, was the bottle of scotch and the glass to accompany it. He had never witnessed his father drink, and couldn't recall a time alcohol had been in the home. He smirked a little at the thought of his dad sneaking a drink in those late nights in here alone. He lifted the bottle and glass, sitting on the desk before removing the only other content of the drawer. It was a thick leather-bound folder, a leather binding wrapped around, then looped close upon a coin that had been fastened as a makeshift button. He reached to his pocket and removed the coin he had retrieved from his father's gravestone and noticed the resemblance. He placed the folder down next to the bottle of scotch and tapping a finger upon it. The dim remnants of the day began to fade away, and soon he found himself flicking on the old desk lamp and leaning over the folder. He wondered why something so simple had been hidden away from the world, and why the man had left another at his father's grave. His curiosity piqued, considering if anything within might give him some insight into who his father was, and maybe even who the man was at the funeral. He let his childhood memories fill his mind as he reached for the bottle, and trying to recall if he might have met this person at some point. The cap turned freely, and the amber liquid soon half-filled the glass, remembering the last time he was scolded for attempting to enter this room. Brian lifted it and turned it in his hand, the light refracting through the liquid and tinting the desk ahead. He took a quick sip, the burning trickling down his throat, before placing the glass down and grabbing for the folder. Unwinding the fastening and laying it open, he was greeted by a collection of various things. First was an envelope, then a journal, and then a stack of smaller files that included their own stacks of paper. He lifted the envelope and took another sip of scotch before pulling a wrinkly, yellow letter from within the matching envelope. He instantly recognized the writing, even behind the stains of dirt and grime. It was shadows of his father. His thumb caressed the page as he stood up from the desk, shoving the coin down in his pocket for later. Then he grabbed the glass and downed a quick swig while reading what appeared to be a letter to his mother. He had seen many of these that his mother kept, but not this one. It had never been mailed, and that made it even more interesting. August 15th, 1944. We have taken the beaches along the Riviera. The locals keep calling it something I can't pronounce. My sergeant said that the Germans were weakened already, and that this was going to be an easy fight. He must have been in the shit a while, since this was his idea of easy. I found moments of fear, I can't lie, especially seeing how many men we lost. Wilkins seems to think that this will be the worst of it, and he's been here longer than me, so I have to trust his word on that one. The main reason I'm writing this is I saw something I wanted to get down on paper. I've heard stories of men losing it out here and seeing things that aren't there. I don't know if I really saw him, and I haven't told anyone else about it for that very reason. I just need a record of it, and hopefully make sense of it when I'm out here. That is, if I get out of here. We were passing through an area near Cannes, and at a half-destroyed cafe, I saw him sitting at a table, sipping coffee just like any other Tuesday evening. He even seemed to ignore the troops that passed him by, just as much as the troops ignored him. Then he suddenly noticed me, raised his glass as if toasting, and took a sip. He gave me that smile again. There's no reasonable explanation for him being here, half a world away from where I saw him just a month ago, but there he was. Scratch was here, and I have no idea why. PFC, Rick Sawyer. Brian sat back down, still holding the letter, wrinkles forming on his forehead. He had never heard the name Scratch before. Maybe it was a nickname of someone his father once knew. He pondered this as he laid the letter down and began to unwrap the leather binding upon the folder. As it fell open, the first page was just words in series. Something like you would do if you had been brainstorming an essay. Scratch, coin, Robert Johnson, Mississippi is how it started, and articles have been folded up in the creases of the book. Brian pressed them open to reveal a message that had information about a young black man dying in Greenwood, Mississippi. At the bottom of the page was 2 drawings, one that resembled the coin that Brian now possessed, and the other looked remarkably like the man he had seen at his father's funeral. Scratch. Brian read the words under the image and wondered if it really was the same man. He seemed to have stumbled on his mystery, and it was getting interesting. He had finished his glass without realizing and tried to pour nothing but air down his gullet. He shook his head a bit before refilling his glass and taking a bit down and turning the page. Directions had been left that would lead someone from Cincinnati, Ohio, all the way to Greenwood, Mississippi. He scanned down the page, noting each turn, and once it ended, he turned the page. Again, folded between the pages, there was more paper that unfolded into road maps. The highways had markings on them in pen as if someone had been keeping track of their destination. The following page had more notes, each line including names and statements. The whole page and the following seemed to be from interviews that his father had conducted once reaching his destination. David Pelham, 44, October 2nd, 1950, Greenwood, Mississippi. According to witness, Robert Johnson was murdered by a man that had caught him sleeping with his wife. Local police reports do not suggest this, and neither does my experience. Bobby Wyatt, 39, October 3rd, 1950, Greenwood, Mississippi. Common rumors say that Robert Johnson made a deal with the devil. His talent was unnatural. Huh. Sounds like Scratch. Regina Moore, 32, October 3rd, 1950, Greenwood, Mississippi. Rumor has it that the deal was made 60 miles north of here, Clarksdale, Mississippi. Willie Brown, 62, October 4th, 1950, Greenwood, Mississippi. Received directions to an intersection, Highway 61 and 49, Clarksdale, Mississippi, Devil's Crossroads. Intersection 6149, October 5th, 1950, Clarksdale, Mississippi. 2 roads intersecting. There was a phone booth, but no scratch. Patrons at Abe's Barbecue, October 5th, 1950, Clarksdale, Mississippi. Most people were hesitant to even speak to me, and I didn't get many answers. No one knows more than I learned back in Greenwood, and no one has heard of a man named Scratch. The owner suggests I speak to the musicians that perform at the local club. After speaking to a few musicians who knew or know Robert Johnson, I am inclined to believe that the rumors have hit a dead end on my leads. No one knows Scratch, but a few of them have noted a man by that description frequenting the club. Brian sat back amazed at the continuing list of names and statements, unsure what to make of it. Everything pointed to a completely impossible notion, and that was that his father had been looking for the devil himself in Mississippi of all places. The liquor warmed his throat again as he shook his head. He paused and scanned the now empty room for a moment before letting out a little chuckle. This had to be a joke, and it was simply left to taunt him, Brian thought. He flipped through the pages, scanning the notes and unfolding newspaper articles that had been left sporadically throughout the journal. All of them seemed to point toward the same unbelievable fact. The more he read, the more real it all seemed to become. His humor was replaced by a growing sense of fear. The small sketches became regular occurrences at the bottom of his entries. Most of them were symbols that meant nothing to Brian, but others seemed to depict rituals involving sacrifice. The further he read, the more grotesque they became, and soon started to truly worry about his father's mindset. His fingers turned to the final page, realizing it to be another letter. Brian almost spat his newly consumed scotch when he realized it was directed to him. Dear son, I know that if you're reading this, it may very well be too late, but I'd like to start with an apology. I haven't been the father you needed or deserved. I've made many mistakes in my life, but know that you are not one of them. Do not ever let my actions or lack thereof take away from your experience in this life. I wish the best for you always. If you've taken the time to read these passages and feel like your old man has become crazy, I would understand completely. Trust me in this. There is evil out there. And even though you never truly understood when I said so, please listen to me now. Do not go looking for Scratch. There are some things you cannot undo, and I would not wish that on you for anything. If he approaches you, for the love of God, do not make him a deal. The price is so great you will not be able to repay it. I hope you learn from my mistakes and rely on the things in this journal as proof. Take care of your mother and yourself. Please forgive me for what I have done. I love you. Dad. Brian had turned into a drunken, sobbing mess upon finishing the letter. He had so many questions that were unanswered, but the one that meant the most had been finalized in his farewell. My father loved me, he whispered to the dark, wiping away the years of uncertainty that had drenched his cheeks. He placed the letter, the journal, and the bottle into a box for scribbling the word, Brian's, on the lid. As he pulled into the parking space of the apartment complex, Brian was still brushing away tears. He didn't want his mother to worry about him any more than she already did. He simply grabbed the gift his father had left him and made his way up the steps. Upon entering, he could see the dim glow of the kitchen light. His mother had waited up for him again. "Brian," she called from the next room. He assured her it was only him and walked in, placing the box upon the counter. She gave him a faint smile. "All finished?" Brian nodded and stepped in to hug her. She laughed a little and squeezed back before questioning. "What's gotten into you tonight?" He released his hold on her and smiled sheepishly, still unsure if he should ask her about his father so soon. Stepping back, Brian rested his hand on the box and pondered for a moment how to bring up the question he needed to ask. "Well," he started and paused again. He hadn't wanted to upset his mother, but he had to know about Mississippi. After a few moments of debating, he gave in to his curiosity. "I don't remember Dad taking many road trips, but I found some directions to Mississippi amongst some of his things. It looked pretty interesting." "Huh." She blushed a bit. "I haven't thought about that in a long time." Her eyes turned to the floor as she smiled, getting lost in a memory. "No, you wouldn't remember that," she said, finally looking up to her son. "You weren't even a year old then." Brian pushed a little harder, wondering what sparked his father's interest in the South. "He went down to visit a friend of his from the war," she said, nodding to herself, as if she was trying to verify her thoughts with facts. Brian leaned in as she spoke, intently waiting for his answer. "Yeah, that's what it was. Your father swore he would have never made it back if it wasn't for him and wanted to thank him personally and see how he was doing," she continued, as if the moment in time was coming back to her in pieces. She sat down slowly at the table where she had left a cup of coffee, her hands forming around it slowly. Brian couldn't help himself. "Mom, do you remember his friend's name?" She tilted her head slightly, her eyes squinting as she searched for the answer. She shook her head gently. "No, he always referred to his buddies by those silly nicknames they gave one another over there. She called him, Scotch? Brian's eyes widened a bit. "Scratch?" His mother smiled, clapping her hands together before pointing toward her son. "That's it. How did you know?" That night, As Brian settled into bed, he found himself thinking of all the things he had discovered. His life had not been quite as he had thought, and now he must consider the truth of it all. His father hadn't despised him. He hadn't hated him, and he may have kept his distance to keep him safe. All of this swirled about in his mind until his eyes grew heavy and he drifted off to sleep. His dreams had become a collaboration of the events of his day. He envisioned himself at the desk again, reading about his father. The words drew him in close and the scene changed, much like a movie. The light dimmed and the clouds rolled overhead. He found himself sitting amongst rubble, confusion setting in. It wasn't a place he was familiar with, and the dream seemed so real that he could smell smoke in the air. He explored the battered building he stood in, death and destruction greeting him. Coming to a stop amongst a group of soldiers, his eyes fell upon a man that he knew to be his father. Large streams of salty liquid came from his father's eyes. He seemed to be praying, but his words had been muffled by the sound of gunfire. Brian knelt beside his father, but seemed to be unnoticed. After a few moments, his father stood slowly, pulling a coin from his pocket. He began to limp across the room before stumbling against a payphone on the other side. Brian followed him at each step and watched as his father picked up the receiver and dropped the coin in the slot. Within seconds, the man he had come to know as Scratch appeared at his father's side. A wicked grin played across his lips as he patted his father on the shoulder. They spoke to one another, but the words seemed garbled. Brian drew closer in an attempt to hear. He must have come within a foot of the two of them before hearing the words,
"So, we have a deal."
The words poured out from Scratch's sinister smile as he extended a hand. Brian's father shook it and nodded. Brian tried to scream out to his father. He tried to beg him to stop, but his words never came. With every effort, only silence found him. Then, in an instant, Scratch turned toward the young man that no one else could manage to see. He drew closer, and Brian attempted to back up, his feet stumbling over the rubble. He came crashing down, but no sound could be heard. Scratch hovered over him for a moment, his eyes now glowing a sickly yellow. Before Brian could react, the man lunged at him with mouth agape. His jaw opened unnaturally, growing large enough to swallow Brian whole. Again, he tried to scream in vain. Soon, he was enveloped by this thing and was plunged into darkness. Brian jolted upright in his bed, sweat cascading from his body. He leaned over to flick on the lamp at his bedside, air rushing in and out of his chest. He was still at home, in his bed and perfectly fine. The dream had made it all seem so real. He still felt dirty from landing on the floor. His hands brushed at his arms and fear crept up his spine, making him shudder. Grime had stained his clothes and bits of debris had accompanied him within the sheets of his bed. Unable to make sense of it all, his eyes turned to the coin that rested by his lamp. Reaching for it, he began turning it between his fingers and thinking of the last line of Rick Sawyer's final words to his son. "Please forgive me for what I have done." Brian flew down I-65 in his canary yellow Dodge Dart. It wasn't much to look at, but it was all he could afford at the time. He had haphazardly crammed what necessities he could into the cramped back seat the night before, prepping for his trip. There were questions that begged to be answered, and there was only one way to find them. Follow his father's directions. The leather-bound folder sat riding shotgun, and pages folded open along with the map. He tapped at the steering wheel in tune with the radio, keeping his eyes open for his next exit. He planned to stop at each designated spot, that is, as long as his money held out. His finger quickly flipped to a section that he had marked with a tap prior to his trip, guiding the car onto the off-ramp of exit 1A. The sign to his right welcomed him to Memphis, Tennessee. He pulled to a stop at the rest area, picking up the folder and placing it in his lap. He scanned over his father's words again as he prepared to make his first real stop on his journey. It had taken him around 7 hours to get to this point, but he knew he had to find out the truth. Beale Street Blues Club, Memphis, Tennessee, September 30th, 1950. I decided to make a stop in Tennessee. There seems to be a large blues community here, and maybe I can get pointed in the right direction. I've already asked a couple of people where to head to find the right scene. I'm being told about a backdoor club downtown. I get the eye walking in. Doubt they see many white men in places like this, but I'm here for a job, not entertainment. Many of the artists here have heard the story of Robert Johnson, and a few of them believe it. I've been told to look for an artist named Frank Stokes down in Mississippi. He used to be a regular here, but he seems to have moved down to Clarksdale. He's been speaking to a man that resembles Scratch's description. Brian searched for Beale Street on his map, finding it wasn't that hard, but the alley was more difficult. The buildings had changed after 18 years, and the place described in his father's notes just didn't exist anymore. This would make his mission more challenging, but not impossible. He began asking people who passed by, mainly the older crowd, if they had heard of this blues club. Some people ignored his questions entirely. Some had no idea what he was talking about, and others seemed to be angry he even asked. The whole task was frustrating, and after about an hour of bad luck, he found a bench to rest his feet. He had been sitting there, staring across the road for a few moments when a leathery hand landed on his shoulder. The sensation caused him to jump, and as he looked back up at the figure behind him, he came face to face with the wrinkled features of an aging old black man. He asked shakily, "Can I help you?" The man didn't respond, only stared down at Brian. He assumed he was staring, that is, considering he couldn't see his eyes behind the large rimmed sunglasses that sat upon the man's face. "Sir?" Brian spoke again, as he tried to lean away. "I heard you're looking for some blues." The words spat out in a raspy tone through the man's jagged and rotting teeth. He patted Brian hard on the back and cackled a bit. "Come on, I can show you." He began hobbling away from the bench, a cane in the other hand. Brian simply watched for a moment, still trying to understand what was happening. The old man stopped, pivoted on the leg he seemed to be favoring, and spoke again. "Well, come on now, boy, I ain't got all day." Brian hopped up and shuffled over to the man. The two of them walked in silence down the block until reaching another alley. The old man didn't skip a beat before turning down the passage. Brian paused at the entrance, knowing this had to be the dumbest idea he had ever had. A canvas roof draped between the two buildings that sat on each side. The cloth blotted out the sun, and if the alley had been any darker, you would need a flashlight. "Come this way, the door's just here. I ain't gonna bite you, boy. I ain't got enough teeth." The old man said with a laugh, before making a chomping motion with his mouth. Brian's nose squinted at the sight of those ragged bits of yellow and black that remained. He had come this far, though, and decided he might as well see what was ahead. He slowly approached the door that the man had pointed at, seeing no handle, but only a porthole with a closed cover. "Just knock on the window and tell 'em Pete sent you. If they ask Pete who, tell 'em it's the only damn blind man that can still find his way to this shithole." The crass words fell out before another wicked laugh. Brian took a step toward the door, raising his shaking hand to form it into a fist. His knuckles rapped on the metal covering the window, causing an echo in the alley. Stepping back to wait, he shoved his hands down into his pockets. He turned to thank the man for his help and noticed that he was gone. His face wrinkled a bit in confusion at the sight. The man had been moving so slowly earlier, there was no way he could have made it back to the street so quickly. His curiosity was broken by the clink of the window opening and a faceless voice calling out, "Who's there?" But Brian, Pete sent me." Brian's voice cracking as he attempted to respond. Laughter could be heard on the other side of the door before the window shut. Brian's shoulders slumped down, and he shook his head in disappointment. I knew this was a dumb idea, he thought, right before a loud sound came from the door. Soon it swung open, and out stepped a dark-skinned man that towered over him. He had to be at least 6'7" and 400 pounds. He loomed over Brian for a moment, arms folded and confusion resting on his forehead. Finally, his voice rumbled. "What's a scrawny white boy like you hanging around that crazy old coot for? Matter of fact, what are you doing coming around here anyway? My people ain't taking too kindly to yours right now if you ain't seen the news." And suddenly, Brian felt the overwhelming urge to run. He was never sure that he had made a mistake following the blind man until right this moment. He had no idea what he was talking about. He had been so busy tending to funeral matters and helping his mother move that he had paid little attention to national matters. He mentally struggled for the words that might keep him from landing a beating in this dark alley, knowing that no one would hear him or see him here. "Listen, I wanted to see this blues club my dad used to talk about. I'm not really from here, so I'm not sure what you mean. You see, my dad passed away earlier this year, and I was following an old road trip plan he left behind." He gave a weak smile in an attempt to convince the man. The hulking figure looked Brian over for a moment, then looked around a bit before agreeing to let him in. Brian stepped up into a dimly lit hallway, and the sound of the metal door crashing shut made him jolt. "Head on down there through that door," the guard said, as he returned to the stool that sat by the door. Brian continued along a crimson-walled corridor, the hard wood floor creaking slightly under his steps. He could already smell the aromas from the room ahead. It was thick, almost to the point of choking him. You could tell that dozens of cigars and cigarettes created a wave of mist that billowed from the doorway. He reached the entrance and stepped just inside to bear witness to a ruckus. People hooped and yelled, danced, and sang along with the artists on stage. The band blared a melody of mixtures of trumpets, saxophones, drums, and guitar. Waitresses dressed scantily buzzed from table to table, taking and receiving orders, and dozens of men lined the bar, some speaking to one another, and others simply placing an order with the bartender. Brian slowly approached the counter, leaning his elbows against it. The bar went silent, all eyes falling on the palest person in the room. The bartender took a few steps in Brian's direction, still cleaning a glass with a towel. "Can I help you, son?" Brian almost missed the question. His eyes scanned the room and noticed that slowly everyone was watching him. He began to feel a knot growing in his throat, and sweat began to bead upon his forehead. He swallowed hard and tried to clear his throat. "My father came to a club like this a long time ago," he said, still looking around the room. "He passed away earlier this year, and I was visiting places he used to go, hoping someone knew him." The words finally falling from his mouth. The bartender gave a half smirk, almost as if he didn't believe him. "How long ago was this? 'Cause you're the first white boy I've seen in here in..." "Probably 18 years ago." His voice had dwindled off, as if he barely believed himself. The men around him erupted in laughter along with the bartender. After a few moments, the man behind the counter waved his hands around a bit to settle the uproar. "All right, okay, fellas, give the kid a break," he said in a calming tone before looking back to Brian. "Listen, kid, there isn't many people from back then here tonight, but if you want to ask some of those old folks at that table over there, be my guest." The thin finger pointed past Brian to a booth in the corner. 4 men sat peeking over toward the commotion, their eyes widening a bit at being singled out. The room slowly returned to life as Brian made his way through it. He overheard many of the patrons whispering about him, and it did little to settle his nerves. As he came to a stop at the table, each of the old men gave him a stern look. He wrung his hands for a moment. "I was just hoping one of you might have known a Rick Sawyer. He was my father." They all looked at one another for a moment, then back at Brian before shrugging and slightly shaking their heads. "He may have been in here asking about Robert Johnson," he continued. The man in the back corner sat forward a bit, and his eyes perked at the statement. You mean the cop?" he blurted out, in more of a statement than a question. Brian nodded in response. "Yeah, you boys remember that fella? He came in here talking about Robert and asking about that deal," he said in a matter-of-fact tone. It clicked in their heads, and they started agreeing and nodding, the man next to him pointing a finger toward Brian. "So that was your pops?" Again, Brian simply nodded in response, but the unease of the situation seemed to be tapering off. They didn't seem as shook by his presence anymore. Each one started conversing about their memories of Rick Sawyer and the night he came asking questions. "Well, what brings you here then, boy?" "I was hoping to find out what all you told him and ask if you knew anything about this," he said sharply, as he pulled the coin from his pocket. He turned it in between his index and thumb, the light glinting from it as it moved. The man at the back of the table stood up slowly, removing the cigar that had hung between his lips and letting it rest on his fingers. He leaned in toward Brian, and the rest of them simply fell silent, looking at the item in his hands. "Listen, boy, if you had any idea what you were really messing with, you wouldn't have brought that here. So I'm gonna tell you something, and then you're gonna walk right back out that door." His words cold and callous. Brian fell back into his nerves, almost shaking at the man's voice. "That right there is a ticket to hell, and you're on the highway. If that's what you're after, you ain't gotta travel far. But both Robert, your pops, and many, many others had to learn the hard way just what that means." Brian tried to explain, but he was cut off. No, you don't say another word. If you want to throw your life away, you take that coin of yours to a payphone and drop it in. He'll come to you, boy, but don't be thinking about doing it here," he said, before pointing toward the exit. Brian stuffed the coin in his pocket and turned toward the exit slowly and passed through the crowd that had fell silent at the tone of the old man's voice. Some of the ones closer to the table had overheard the conversation, and they scowled at him as he left. He lowered his head slightly when passing the bar. Everyone sat waiting for his exit. When he approached the doorman, Brian noticed him shaking his head with a smile. Told you you don't need to be up in here," he said with a laugh in his voice. The door was unlocked and pushed free, held open by the guard. Brian began to step down, and just as he was clear of the door, he turned to the man one more time with a question. "One more thing. What about Frank Stokes? Is he still down in Clarksdale?" The guard shook his head. "That cat died in 1955, just like you're gonna if you keep poking around in things you don't know nothing about." With that, the door slammed shut in Brian's face, and he was left alone in the dark alley. He sighed in disappointment, pulling the coin from his pocket again. It turned between his fingers as he thought about the warning he received and what was said about the payphone. He remembered his father dropping the coin in one within his dream. Was it really that easy to summon the devil? This thought echoed in his mind as he began walking toward the street. When he reached the end, he noticed the streetlights hum and slowly come to life. It was late. He was tired, and it would be far too dangerous to drive in this state. A shop owner nearby was kind enough to give him directions to the nearest lodging. It was only about a mile away, and he quickly pulled into the parking lot. The sign illuminated his car amongst the dark and read, "The Lorraine Motel." As he exited his car and stepped past a group of people to reach the door, he noticed how much attention he seemed to get. It was slightly unnerving how closely the group watched him enter the building. He quickly passed through the doorway and approached the front counter. A tawny-skinned young woman sat behind the desk, flipping through a magazine for a moment before Brian cleared his throat to signify his arrival. The woman jerked her head upward, obviously startled by the noise, and made eye contact with Brian. Her gaze seemed to widen slightly as she stood, approached the counter and asked, "Can I help you, sir?" Brian requested a room and the young woman seemed shocked. "Are you sure you want to stay here?" The idea that he wouldn't want to stay was confusing and led him to wonder why they wouldn't want his business. "Is there not a room available or something?" he questioned, annoyance in his voice. He had been on the road for many hours and had endured enough humiliation for one night. He simply wanted to go to bed and let this day wash away in dreams. "Well, it's not that, it's just, it may not be safe for you to stay here." Her voice cracked a bit in the reply. The thought of being unsafe made Brian instantly turn and observe his surroundings. It seemed like a typical hotel, kind of on the cheap side, but normal. His eyes scanned the chairs in the lobby before landing on a plaque just above it. It was an image of a man he recognized, and it drew him closer. As he approached, he read the words, "Dr. Martin Luther King Jr." The words below it had been slightly smaller, but from the news he had witnessed earlier that year, he knew what it would say. The warning and the looks from the men all made sense now, worry playing on his face. He gave a quick thank you to the lady behind the desk and made his way to the door. Peering out slowly, he couldn't see the men anymore. He only had to make it to his car and he'd be fine. The door opened slowly, Brian's head peeking out in each direction. When the coast seemed clear, he began a brisk walk towards the Dodge. He internally counted his steps, his heart quickening with each higher number. His eyes scanned the area as he moved, and as soon as he laid his hand on the door handle, he gave a slight sigh of relief. His shirt jerked backward, his body following after. He soon found himself staring up into the night sky and feeling a dreadful pain on his back. The group of men hovered over him now, some with expressions of anger, and others seemingly very excited. The largest of the few stood just over Brian's head and leaned down quickly to greet him. "You're on the wrong side of town, boy," before dropping a large ball of saliva onto Brian's forehead. His feet and fists began pummeling his body, his arms rising in defense. He attempted to roll over, but the men didn't relent. He managed to his side and began crawling as best as he could, begging them to stop all the while. The assault slowed and laughter erupted as each one found humor in Brian's attempt to escape. He had only made it a few feet when he felt a heel drive into his backside, shoving him down into the pavement. After a moment of gasping, he started to rise. He felt the burn of the gash that had been left on his cheek, but did not allow that to stop him. The men had been between himself and his car. His only safety would be the motel. He hobbled in the direction of the doors, feeling the warmth of his tears stinging his wounds. They followed and shoved him repeatedly, his body aching from every touch. Then his worst fear came in as a voice of one of his attackers said, "Get the bat." Brian looked over his shoulder to see one of them making a dash for a vehicle. If they returned with any sort of weapon, he knew he would be finished. He couldn't die this far from home with no one or nothing. He couldn't let it all end here. When he finally reached the door, one of them attempted to pull him back. Somewhere within him, his fight response kicked in, and his elbow flew backward towards his assailant's face. It collided with a crack, feeling bone give way to his attack. The man stumbled, grasping at his nose and yelling for help. Brian slung the door open and fell inside. The woman behind the desk screamed, "I don't need this, man, you need to leave." The men didn't enter, but they didn't leave the parking lot either. Brian just knew they would stay there all night if they had to. He couldn't assume the desk clerk would be willing to call the police to assist him, and he couldn't fight them all off. He lay there in the floor trying to find a solution when he noticed the payphone by the door. The idea was horrible, but it's what he had come all this way for anyway. All he needed now was the coin. Pain shot up his shoulder as he rummaged through his pocket, pulling out random change and lint. He had almost made it to the phone before he found the right coin amongst his change. As he lifted the receiver, the woman behind the desk informed him that it wasn't in operation. That fact rang true when there was no dial tone. His forehead rested against the phone, eyes closing as the tears continued to fall. He simply dropped the coin in the slot anyway, and watched as it fell through the return. His body slipped back to the floor, letting the receiver hang beside him. He sat there, eyes closed tight and sobbing to himself. What have I got myself into? He thought. A hand rested on Brian's head, causing his eyes to open wide in that direction. His attire had changed, but it was the man he had been searching for. It was hard to forget, despite the lack of yellowing eyes. He was just the same as his dream. Scratch leaned over to the change return and lifted the shiny round object from it. It turned between his thin fingers, and suddenly the world seemed to come to a halt. Brian examined the room around him for a moment. He couldn't even hear the clock on the wall ticking anymore. It all became still before Scratch looked down at the beaten young man.
Looks like you need some help, Brian.
Rick Sawyer's son followed in his footsteps and bargained with the devil for his life. The deal was sealed with a handshake, and Scratch smirked, gesturing for Brian that it was now safe to leave. He approached the door and noticed the men frozen in place. Scratch snapped his hands closed around the spinning coin, and everything sprang into motion. The blaring horn of a large truck could be heard in the distance, and before the group outside could react, a 2-ton vehicle plowed through them. Their remains piled high along the street in front of the motel as Brian quickly rushed for his car. The woman from the front desk had come out screaming at the sight before rushing back inside to call the police. The engine roared to life with a quick turn of a key. The passenger doors shut as well, seconds before the tires peeled across the pavement. The sirens echoed in the distance as he turned down a side road and headed back to the interstate. Scratch leaned over slightly from the passenger side, his voice detailing the conditions of their deal through a wicked grin. Brian had never pushed the Dodge this hard, his foot buried to the floorboard. The tires came to a screeching halt under the dim light of a truck stop just outside the on-ramp. Brian slammed the car in park, his heart still racing in his chest. He had barely listened to a word his new passenger had said over the last few minutes. He was too focused on fleeing the horror of the hotel. So, let me get this straight, his words coming through gasps. One day, you're gonna come for me and collect on the debt I now owe?
You've got it, kid. I mean, I did save your life after all. Them boys are ready to string you up.
Scratch shot a finger toward him, his smug expression growing. How long do I have? Brian asked, fear showing within his eyes.
Ah, now that's the question, isn't it? I mean, it depends. Usually enough time to live a little. 20 to 30 years, maybe. I mean, I'm not a complete devil.
Scratch laughed at his own pun as he picked up Rick Sawyer's journal. Brian watched as a man flipped through it, scanning over his father's words. He couldn't help but wonder if this is how his father felt after his run-in with Scratch. He wondered how full a life he could possibly live, knowing that it had such an early expiration date. He thought of how secluded his father had been, and suddenly it all made sense. Rick Sawyer had tried to protect his wife and son from the choice he had made. I'm going inside to take a leak. It's a long road back to Cincinnati. Brian's words almost a scowl as he opened his driver's door.
What? The road trip with dear old Dad over already?
Scratch mocked him. Brian leaned over, malice forming on his features. I came for answers. I have them and so much more. I'm ready to go home. Somehow the smile that rested on his passenger's face grew wider.
But you haven't even asked the most important question yet, kid.
Oh yeah? What's that? Brian replied, in the tone of a typical angsty teen. The journal clapped closed as Scratch leaned closer, his words come just above a whisper.
Don't you want to know how to get out of the deal?
Shock transformed Brian's facial expression. He had never once let the idea of being able to break this curse cross his mind. If you could break a deal, then what was the point of making it in the first place? He stood, contemplating this before asking an answer. Scratch gladly informed him that all he needed was to present the coin as a gift to someone else, and the terms of that deal would pass to that person. That is, if they used the coin.
I mean, why else would your dad spend so much time looking for me?
The man said, while leaning back in his seat.
He forgot to ask that question too, and it took him a while to find me again. Poor bastard.
What do you mean? You got what you wanted. You took his soul, Brian barked. Scratch obviously found this completely hilarious. His cackles echoed from the car. He even slapped his knee in a most cartoonish fashion. He wiped at fake tears and tried to compose himself. He even attempted to respond, but seemed to be wrapped in a fit of his own enjoyment.
Silly boy. I didn't take your pops.
Brian almost stumbled at the thought. He was sure he had solved the mystery of the man he never truly knew. The truth came crashing down on him, his hand grasping the door for support. His mind retraced the events leading to his father's death, and nothing made sense. He tried to speak, but his voice got lost within his throat. A million questions clouded his thoughts. When he finally spoke, the words came slow. If not you, then why? Scratch stopped laughing, his face drawing in seriousness.
Well, after your father found me and asked the right questions, he spent the next few years trying to find the right person to give the coin to.
Brian sat back down and listened to a story of how his father had been working a case involving a double homicide. A man named Victor Polora had assaulted and killed 2 young girls, leaving them for dead in an abandoned building. His father had been the lead detective, and though he knew Victor had committed the crimes, their evidence had been tampered with and had been deemed inadmissible in court. The frustration of having such a monster back on the street was more than Rick could stand, and when he took a seat at his desk one night, the idea formed quickly in his head.
So you see.
Scratch removed a small box from his pocket, slipping a cigarette from it and placing it between his lips.
Your dear old dad let Victor have the coin.
He finished speaking before the tip of his smoke was ignited, and the mist lifted into the air around him in a cloud. As Scratch spoke, Brian started remembering the name Victor Polora from his father's files. He had at least a drawer full on that case, so it was hard to forget. His father had become obsessed with that man, and he remembered the long nights Rick would spend in his study trying to crack the case. Now he knew why and what lengths his father would go to in order to seek justice. His thought process was interrupted as he realized that truly did not answer his question. What does that have to do with my dad's death? Scratch smiled while dragging on his cigarette, then releasing the smoke again.
Well, kid, if someone gave you a death sentence, what would you ask the devil to do for you?
Scratch didn't have to say another word. Brian had his answer. It rolled in his head again and again. His legs became weak, his body lowering to a crouching position. His eyes rested toward the ground as he thought of the possibility that his father's attempt at redemption had literally killed him. His despair slowly turned to rage, his body rising from the ground as he shoved an open palm forward. Give me that damn coin. Scratch pulled the shiny object from his jacket pocket, flicking it from the tip of his thumb. It landed perfectly within Brian's waiting hand.
Just like your old man,
he said, as more smoke billowed from his lips. The smoke engulfed the car, far more than he could have exhaled. Brian had to shield his mouth, coughing from the cloud of nicotine. His eyes watered as he drew back the coin and placed it in his pocket. When the mist dissipated, Scratch was gone. A week later, Victor Polora stepped into the lobby of his apartment building. His key turned upon his mail slot and opened slowly. Only a single white envelope sat inside, and he quickly took it in his hands. There was no address, but simply the words, "A gift from Rick Sawyer." His eyes widened and a paranoia filled his body. He found himself looking around the lobby, but he was alone. He tore it open from one end, and as he tilted the correspondence, a small round coin landed between his fingers. He stood in shock, sure that Rick Sawyer was dead. He had even witnessed the funeral. He searched the lobby and yelled out to question who had left the message. He received no response. His eyes turned back to the folded paper, and upon the back he read the words, "If you want to settle this, meet me on the corner of 3rd and Columbia at 10 p.m. Victor stood under the flickering light of a street lamp, his hands tucked in the pockets of his jacket, one of which gripped a pistol. He paced back and forth, occasionally glancing at his watch. When the hand ticked by to identify the proper meeting time, and he had seen no one approach, he grumbled to himself. He cursed out into the night just before he felt the hard metal of a barrel press against the back of his head. A dark laugh rumbled from the man. "You have no idea who you're messing with." "No, you don't know who you've messed with. My name is Brian Sawyer, and you killed my father." The pain and anger reverberated in every word from Brian's mouth. Victor's eyes widened at the sound of the hammer being drawn back behind him. He began to plead for his life, but it fell on deaf ears. Brian had no intention of letting this man get away. He was going to end this ridiculousness once and for all. "You're going to step over to that payphone and drop that coin in the slot. If you run, I shoot you. If you try to fight, I shoot you. If you try anything but what I have instructed, you die." Brian had never sounded so cold in his entire life. He watched as Victor slowly approached the lighted booth, raised the receiver, and dropped the coin into the slot. Within seconds, a car came screeching to a halt beside them. From the passenger side stepped Scratch, and he thanked the driver before approaching the two men. He winked at Brian before stepping over to Victor. He reached down, removed the coin from the return slot where it landed.
"Good to see you again, Victor."
He smiled back to Brian.
"Good going, kid. Looks like you're off the hook."
Victor smiled, assuming he had already figured out a solution to his problem. He asked Scratch to eliminate his new problem just like he had the last, his grin becoming monstrous as his focus fell on Brian. Scratch patted the man in the booth on the back and laughed, which caused Victor to laugh as well, but nervously. The feeling of unease grew more when the sound like a pack of barking dogs echoed in the distance.
"You see, Victor, I only do favors once. If you drop the coin again, then you're just mine."
Scratch's hand rested on his shoulder, gripping tight onto his jacket. Brian stood a few feet away, his hand gripping on the pistol as a silhouette of canines emerged from the shadows. The closer they got, the larger they seemed to be. There had to be at least 6 of them, and each slobbered and snapped at the air around them in their approach. Their eyes glowed an otherworldly red hue, and their bodies were as dark as the shadows that accompanied them. Victor attempted to flee, but Scratch's grip held him in place. The hounds drew in and latched onto the quivering man before dragging him back toward the nothingness they had emerged from. Brian's face should have been of fear, but at this very moment he smiled. He had finally found justice for his father, and the 2 girls Victor had killed. He imagined his father putting his arm around him and thanking him. A single tear trailed his cheek as he finally lowered the pistol. Scratch slowly made his way to Brian, the coin turning between his fingers. When he stopped beside the young man, the coin came to a stop. He reached over and dropped it within Brian's palm. Scratch flashed a grin before speaking.
"Good doing business with you, kid. I will be seeing you around."
The words faded into the wind as he disappeared into a cloud of smoke.